toward drugs, there's still strict conditions. So with that, Eugene, I want to direct the time to you. In Malaysia and Singapore, there's an increase. We see an increase in discretion available to judges regarding the imposition of the death penalty. In Singapore, what are the factors judges typically look at when considering a death penalty? And is there a trend of judges increasingly exercising their discretion?
Okay. Now, in Singapore, what we have is in 2012, there were certain amendments made to the Misuse of Drugs Act, as well as to the Penal Code, Section 300 and Section 302, which govern murder. The mandatory death penalty was modified for murder under limb 300A, that is the intention to cause death. It's still the penalty is still the mandatory death penalty. However, for 300B, 300C, 300D, the judge will have a discretion as to whether to impose death or life imprisonment. Moving over to drugs, the first determination that a judge will have to make upon conviction is the accused person a mere courier? What that means is that whether the person is just simply moving drugs from one place to another. In other words, he's not breaking down bundles of drugs to smaller amounts and selling it to people. He's just a courier moving drugs from one place to another, which would typically be the usual case where Malaysians get caught in Singapore, because they would not be involved in furthering drug trafficking within Singapore, in the sense that they would not be dealing with multiple customers, but rather they are coerced or made to bring a large bundle to Singapore and just hand it over to whoever they asked to hand it over to in Singapore. So that's the first prerequisite for a judge, before the judge exercises his discretion. The person must be a mere courier. And then there are two alternative scenarios. One is where the public prosecutor has issued a certificate to say that the accused person has provided substantial assistance to the authorities, meaning he has provided information which has led to the arrest of other people involved in the trafficking network. Or alternatively, the person has available to him the defense of diminished responsibility. That is a mental condition which diminishes his legal responsibility for drug trafficking. So to repeat, first, in either event, you must be a mere courier. And once you're a mere courier, you either be given a certificate of substantial assistance, or you are able to come under defense of diminished responsibility. Only then would the judge have a discretion whether to sentence you to life imprisonment or death. It is somewhat similar to the amendments, well, similar but not the same, as the amendments that were made in Malaysia in 2018. In 2018, in Malaysia, judges were given the discretion to impose life instead of death, where again, a person was a courier or there was a agent provocateur involved. Person had assisted the enforcement agencies. So it's a similar provision that was brought into force in Malaysia in 2018. But I understand, from the cases that I've seen, there appears to be some confusion as to whether, when we talk about assisting authorities, whether this is something which the Attorney General of Malaysia has to certify, or whether the Malaysian courts could make a finding based on the evidence before. Right? Anyway, that's all moot, because the good news is from last year, you guys have taken out those conditions, and the judges are now free to decide um, uh, with their full discretion how, when to impose death, when to impose life. I think that's an overview of where the position is in Singapore and where the position is in Malaysia. So the difference you can see is in Singapore, the judges' hands are still tied in that they can only impose life imprisonment for drug trafficking under certain very limited scenarios, much like your 2018 amendments. For murder, 300A, the judges' hands are tied, but they have a discretion where it comes to 300B, 300C, 300D. Now, maybe the next thing I would like to talk about is how judges have applied this discretion in Singapore and in Malaysia. Insofar, first we start with murder. Insofar as the test in Singapore, when you're dealing with 300B, 300C, or 300D, when the judge decides whether to impose a term of life imprisonment or death, the test has been articulated as whether the offender's actions outrage the feelings of the community or whether he has exhibited a blatant disregard for human life. And that was the test laid down in the case of Koh Jia Bing. Malaysia for murder has similar but a different test. I think it was laid down in the case of Alawoni, Oluwajuwon, Gilbert, and PP. I think it's August 2023 decision. In that case, I think it was a review case because he had previously been sentenced to death. I beg your pardon. It's not it may not be a review case, but anyway, what the judges held in Gilbert's case was that the death penalty would be justified where the murders committed were extremely savage, heinous, diabolical, gruesome, cruel, horrendous, or brutal, and shocks not only the judicial conscience, but even the collective conscience of society. And they've given some broad guidelines in that case that where you're dealing with hired or serial killers, rapists who kill their victims for the purposes of sexual gratification, dismember the bodies of victims, dangerous criminals who use firearms, and those who plan a murder and execute it in a cold-blooded manner. So the test, insofar as when the death penalty is applicable for murder, is somewhat similar with a slight difference in Singapore and in Malaysia. Now, insofar as how the Malaysian courts are going to exercise their discretion in sentencing when it comes to drug trafficking, I think there's still not enough case law to see a trend. So perhaps I'll focus more on the Singapore position. In Singapore, where you have a mere courier who has been certified to have provided substantial assistance, I think in every one of those cases, the court has exercised its discretion in favor of life imprisonment. There's not a single case where a judge has, in any case, imposed the death penalty. For where there's the defense of diminished responsibility, the judge has to, where a drug trafficker is a mere courier and he's able to avail himself the defense of diminished responsibility, the Singapore judge must impose life imprisonment and not death. Based on, and there are a number of cases where the accused person has been able to show that he suffered from diminished responsibility. There was a recent case, Rosaidi, where the Court of Appeal considered, even though the accused person knew what he was doing and knew what he was doing was wrong, The accused person in that case suffered from a major depressive disorder and substance use disorder. So he was hooked on drugs. He knew that he was selling drugs, but he was able to show that he was selling drugs because he was hooked to drugs. And what the psychiatrist said was that the fact that he suffered from a major depressive disorder, coupled with his substance use disorder, made it very, very difficult for him to resist taking drugs, and he only sold the drugs to finance his drug habit. And so the Court of Appeal agreed that in this case, because he had major depressive disorder coupled with the substance use disorder, it put him in a different category, made it harder than the usual person to resist drugs, and therefore to sell drugs to support that habit which he couldn't give up.
So,
yes, go ahead.
Eugene, you talked about both cases in Singapore and Malaysia and how judges applied the death penalty. But in your experience, since you have also experienced handling cases of Malaysians facing the death penalty in Singapore, how do the differing cultural, religious, and socio-political context between Singapore and Malaysia influence the public perception and implementation of the death penalty? Were there stark differences in capital punishment cases when the defendant or inmate is a foreigner versus a citizen in Singapore?
No, I mean, the trial process is fair. The rules are the same. There are presumptions which apply where you're caught with more than a certain amount of drugs. That's the same whether you're Malaysian, whether you're Singaporean, whatever nationality you are, the law is the same, and the law is applied in the same way. Earlier, I alluded to the fact that the defense, or rather the sentence of life may be more readily available to a foreigner because simply he's not going to be involved in repacking and distributing drugs in Singapore. He's generally only going to be involved in the transportation of a bulk of drugs from a mastermind outside Singapore to someone in Singapore who's then going to traffic. Now, what I think would be interesting is that since Malaysia no longer has a mandatory death penalty for drug trafficking, it will be interesting as to how people start viewing Malaysians sentenced to death in Singapore, because previously I think it was difficult for Malaysians to say anything because Malaysia had the same penalty. But now that Malaysia has done away with it, and if you look at the remarks that were made in Parliament when Malaysia did away with the mandatory death penalty, I believe it was the Deputy Law Minister at that time, Mr. Ram Kapal Singh, who said that, he used words like the death penalty has been an ineffective deterrent. We cannot arbitrarily ignore the existence of the inherent right to life of every individual. The death penalty has not brought about the results it was intended to bring. So I guess because of the amendments in Malaysia and the reasons for doing away with the mandatory death penalty, I think the discussion would have to move as when we talk about foreigners or Malaysians being sentenced to death.
So
that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And it's actually really interesting because recently, at least from my view, is that death penalty cases have been getting a lot more attention from the public, whether negative, positive, one camp for, one camp against. I feel like the attention that has been placed on death penalty in Southeast Asia has increased. So with that, so we have a lot of lawyers and activists and people in CSO with us today in the audience. What can lawyers and activists working on this issue learn from these cases and from Singapore's considerations when imposing the death penalty? Do you see any lessons that they can take away, any best practices that they can take away that you have seen over the years?
You mentioned, you started off by mentioning that the death penalty is getting a lot of attention from people across Southeast Asia. I mean, that's correct. And I mean, one interesting thing that we all must note, you see a lot of surveys being done, a lot of, as to whether people support the death penalty or whether people don't support the death penalty, whether people think it's a deterrent, whether people don't think it's a deterrent. What has come clear from people who have studied these different kinds of surveys is that it all depends on how specific the question is asked. You see, if you ask a person a general question, whether you support the death penalty or not, I mean, you get a general answer, and it's probably going to, and I think, at least in Singapore, what those kind of questions have, the answers to those kinds of general questions would have been, yes, we support the death penalty. But when they are given scenarios, meaning they're given more information about the type of people who are hung, and under what circumstances, what was the offense, then the answers are not so much clear. We support the death penalty. So I think one thing we all have to realize when it comes to surveys, it is because people must be given full information, and when information is not given to them, they are unable to come. I mean, the answers are uninformed answers. So that's one thing we have to bear in mind. Now, in terms of what we can glean from the Singapore cases, I think how the Malaysian, I mean, we've seen already that for murder, the test is more or less the same. Insofar as how Malaysian judges may start sentencing in relation to drug cases, I mean, certainly cooperation with the authorities, whether a person is just a mere courier, mental disorders, would play a very large role in whether a judge sentences someone to life or death. But what is welcoming in Malaysia is that the judge is not just bound by one, just a few factors, or bound in a certain way in which he has to approach it, meaning A must be present and then B or C present. He's not bound in that kind of scenario. He's entitled to look at the case as a whole and entitled to exercise his discretion in deciding how much weight do I want to give to the fact that this person is a first offender, how much weight do I want to give to a person who is a mere courier, but may not have assisted the authorities, or how about someone who's not a mere courier but has assisted, someone suffering from a mental impairment, but he's not a mere courier. So the welcoming position in Malaysia is that the judges are not, that the hands are not tightly. They are going to be allowed to look at various mitigating factors, some aggravating factors, and form their own law as to what should be the test, what weight should be given to what particular mitigating factors when they decide whether to sentence to life or death. And I mean, the Singapore experience would be where judges have a choice. They tend to gravitate towards life imprisonment, certainly for drug trafficking, and murder, yes, unless it shocks the conscience.
Okay. Following that, so with this new changes and developments in Malaysia and Singapore, and with the discourse on abolitionism versus retentionism regarding the death penalty, how should lawyers frame their argument in representing clients on death row? Whether in court arguments or legal representation in general, do they play a role in changing the discourse of death penalty do you see a difference there?
It is difficult to argue in court successfully that the death penalty is unconstitutional because I think both Singapore's and Malaysia's provisions do not exclude the death penalty. In fact, it seems to be understood when you consider the further liberties. Just like life and liberty cannot be taken away save in accordance with law. So it does contemplate the death penalty. So, and I mean, in the past, lawyers, I think both in Malaysia and Singapore, have tried to argue that because depending on how the public prosecutor frames the charge, some charges carry the death penalty, some don't, and therefore it is actually the prosecutor who's choosing sentence, and therefore that's unconstitutional. So some of these arguments have been made, they've been rejected by the courts. So it's difficult at the moment to try to frame an argument that's going to win favor either in the Malaysian court or Singapore court to say that the death penalty per se is unconstitutional. I think what lawyers can do is to highlight cases where someone could have gotten the death penalty, or cases where someone who had got the death penalty clearly doesn't deserve it, and to show that human beings are fallible. Prosecutors make mistakes, defense lawyers make mistakes, judges make mistakes, and that penalty is irreversible. And I think maybe we can draw on some experience when it's something similar. Singapore used to have Section 377A, and that's the statute which criminalizes male homosexuality. There were many challenges to court, asking the court to rule that Section 377A was unconstitutional because it breaches the equality clause in the Constitution. The argument most frequently brought was that female same-sex relationships are not illegal. So why is male same-sex relationships criminalized? So the courts have had to grapple with this question a number of times. And most recently, the last 1 or 2 years, the Court of Appeal came very close to saying it was unconstitutional, but they declined to make that ruling. They held that because the government has said that Section 377A is not enforced in practice, the litigants who brought the action had no locus standi, no standing in law to bring the action, and therefore they did not have to rule. But the hint was there that it would breach the equality provision in the Constitution. Singapore government considered the Court of Appeal's decision. I think it had put some, maybe pressure is not the right word to use, but it given them some impetus to put the matter before Parliament, and Parliament decided to strike that, to take away Section 377A. So, in a sense, I mean, while I think it's difficult to get a court ruling but nevertheless, I mean, egregious examples, if the public is educated about, where someone is hung when, majority of people would say that he doesn't deserve it, or if, someone is not hung because and a problem in the legal process is highlighted. I think all this will educate the public and move the government towards thinking carefully about whether we should still retain the death penalty or not.
So you mentioned earlier where like the public prosecutor has a role in actively choosing what sentence to, and I just wanted to clarify or get a bit more information about the second part of my question, where it's like legal representation in general. Do you think that plays a role in changing the discourse, and do you think that plays a role in maybe changing the trends of judges exercising their discretion for imposing the death penalty?
I mean, judges will have to be guided by the arguments made by lawyers, and I think there can be strong legal arguments as to why, in a particular case, a certain offender should not be sentenced to death. Um, mental conditions, cooperation with the authorities, the extent of criminality, maybe even the background of a person and why the person did it. I mean, lawyers will make these arguments in courts, and the law will develop. And I think how we see the law developing would be away from, I mean, judges exercising their discretion to give life imprisonment instead of death. Earlier, when I spoke about the argument about prosecution choosing sentence, what what uh, what that argument is really is that, especially where you have the death penalty for trafficking in more than a certain amount of drugs, what prosecutors in Malaysia or Singapore sometimes do is to amend the charge to say not more than the capital amount. So then the judge can give a high jail sentence instead of death, even though factually the actual amount is more. So in that sense, because they choose a non-capital offense, they are actually choosing the sentence a particular offender will receive. And because uh, I think both our constitutions vest judicial power with the judiciary and not with the prosecution, I think lawyers in Malaysia and Singapore have previously tried to argue that that makes a lot of these offences unconstitutional.
Thank you for that. So now I'm going to pass the time to Mindy. She will handle the Q&A section. Mindy?
Hello, Eugene, and hi.
Hi.
So I have received some questions from our audience. So the first question from our audience is, how do you manage the emotion level that comes with your line of work?
Yeah, I mean, it is difficult. It's always difficult to take on capital cases. Usually, you spend quite a lot of time with them because you'll be preparing for trial. You spend a lot of time seeing them in prison, preparing, explaining a strategy or brainstorming for strategies on how to approach the trial, taking their instructions, and thereafter you would often act for them in the appeal as well. So you spend a lot of time with them. There are bonds which form with them, with their families, because you spend quite a lot of time with their families as well. And so it is emotionally quite devastating, when they are sentenced to death, when they are hanged. As when I was younger, I mean, it was something which I felt very difficult to deal with. As you get older, of course, you become more desensitized to it, or you try. And um, it's still disturbing. It's still very disturbing. It leaves you disturbed, but you tell yourself, I mean, you have to pick yourself up and try your best for the next client. So, that's the best way you can um, contribute to the system, and hopefully you win the next one.
Thank you, Eugene. So I have another question. Is what is the likely outlook of the penalty in Southeast Asia? Any recommended material to gain a deeper understanding? And should we have a stance?
Yeah, I mean, we ultimately, I mean, everyone has their own opinion and stance. If you ask me for my opinion, I think that penalty should go, because it is just not, it's just inhuman, and also because mistakes can be made. So that's my personal view. It's up to, I can't force that view on anybody, and I won't seek to do that. But I mean, if enough people are of that view, then, and I think in time, as with other societies, that have been around longer, I mean, eventually you will see, hopefully in our lifetime, but if not in the next generation, you'll see that the death penalty will be done away with. I have no doubt about that. The only doubt I have is how long more is it going to take? And I mean, there are a lot of people, I mean, like you guys and a lot of other people in the region who've been doing a lot of positive work, liaising with governments, speaking to people, putting forward your views in a good, balanced, and cogent manner to try to put your point across as to why the death penalty is no longer appropriate in today's day and age. So I am confident that death penalty will be done away with. The question really is how long will it take?
Thanks, Eugene, for the answer. So now there's a okay. So now we open floor to our audience to ask question. If you have a question, you can unmute yourself. Does anyone have the question?
Going to read. So we did receive a question in the chat box from Wen Lee. I will just read it now. So Wen Lee asked, "Hi
Okay.
Eugene. So is Malaysia more advanced?" She has 3 questions. So the first one is Malaysia more advanced, humane, and civilized than Singapore? How many people has Singapore hanged in Lee Hsien Loong's term as Prime Minister and PAP hanged? When will Singapore have a moratorium and abolish the death penalty?
I think for the time being, the government has made their position clear. I mean, Singapore government believes that it is an effective deterrent, and they have made it clear that they will not compromise on the death penalty. I mean, what they have done, however, in 2012 is to give judges a discretion. I mean, where you're just a mere courier, and either you've cooperated or there's a mental disorder involved. So in the short run, I don't see any change in the government's position. I mean, Malaysians, of course, are very, very nice people. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt or issue there. To ask me a pointed question, I mean, I think it's very difficult. It's not fair for me to answer. And yeah, I mean, I hope Singapore moves in the same direction that Malaysia is going, but it will take some time.
Okay, so we're gonna open up the floor to questions. Does anyone have a question? You guys can unmute yourself. Or you can raise your hand. I can unmute you. All right. Okay. So we are going to go back to some more questions that we did receive through the Google form registration. So could the abolishment of the mandatory death penalty be seen as criminals having it easy without the fear of capital punishment?
That's the view which people who are arguing for the death penalty to be retained share. They say that if you don't have the death penalty anymore, I mean, there's no deterrence against drug trafficking in particular. I don't think doing away with the death penalty will make it easier for criminals, because especially when I look at the Malaysian legislation, I mean, it provides for punishments of 30, 40 years, which is, I mean, basically, I mean, for an adult person, I mean, that could be the rest of your natural life. I mean, even though I know Malaysia has done away with life imprisonment as being your natural life, but the punishments are still very, very harsh, and there's caning. So I do not think that there would be any less deterrence, and I don't think there are any serious studies which show that if you do away with the death penalty, you are unable to deter would-be drug traffickers.
Okay, and following that question, so following right now with modern moral standards and modern ethical standards as it is right now, is the death penalty ethical when you weigh it against these modern standards or modern opinions about life?
Well, I mean, if you go into the area of morality, I mean, we talk about uh, life being sacred. You know, we don't quite understand. I mean, we all have our beliefs, but I mean, scientifically, we don't understand where life comes from. What right do you have to take it away? I mean, but these are all very philosophical arguments. I think the stronger arguments, I mean, which we can back by figures, facts and figures, is and people find it hard to argue against, is that people do make mistakes, and the death penalty can be meted out by mistake, and that kind of a mistake is irreversible. So I think that that would be one of the stronger arguments, which is based on logic and common sense, which would be very difficult to refute.
Okay, we have a question from Nikita from the chat box. If later down the road evidence is presented on a defendant that has passed from the death penalty, will their family be awarded damages? And she has another one. The UK did away with the death penalty eons ago and kept life imprisonment. In your opinion, is that a better alternative to the death penalty?
The answer is, if someone's wrongfully hanged, certainly, and evidence comes out later that he was wrongfully hanged, certainly the family would be entitled to sue the state. Um, the question would really be as to the quantum of damages, and that would depend. Is he like completely innocent, or is it a case where he should be sentenced to something else? I mean, all these factors play. What did he do before? What did he do for a living before he was hanged? I mean, these are all factors which go towards determining the quantum damages. But as a cause of action, certainly, I mean, the state can be sued for causing wrongful death. And if you could remind me of the second
Yeah.
part of the question.
So the second part is the UK did away with the death penalty and they kept life imprisonment. In your opinion, is that a better alternative to the death penalty?
In my opinion, yes. And I think the Malaysian position may be even better, where you're talking about very, very lengthy periods of jail term, 30, 40 years. Whereas I think in the UK system, which probably would be similar to Singapore, where you get life imprisonment, it means after 20 years, you become eligible for parole, and the state decides whether to grant you parole or not, and when to grant you. Whereas I think the Malaysian position, you can be sentenced 30, 40 years. I think that's a very good deterrent.
Okay, and this is another question we received through the Google Forms. It's more towards the lawyers in general in Singapore. Somebody asked, why do lawyers in Singapore why are they more hesitant to take up appeal cases?
I do not think that lawyers in Singapore are more hesitant to take up appeal cases. I mean, the law gives, I mean, where cases start in the High Court, our law is you have one appeal to the Court of Appeal. And I don't think there's any shortage of lawyers who will take on that case. We are talking about the appeal has been exhausted, the legal appeal, and the presidential clemency has been exhausted, and someone's been fixed to be hung, to be hanged. Then you have, as a litigation tactic to prevent a hanging, you have lawyers going to court to try to argue that he should not be hanged. If there's a real point to be taken, by all means, take it. If it's a litigation tactic, people who do not agree with such tactics will criticize such tactics. People who believe that, look, I mean, you must give this person a right to be heard before he's hanged, will argue that, look, you cannot stop these lawyers from coming forward to argue these cases. Ultimately, at the moment, the courts have said, look, unless you have a serious argument to be made, if you come before us, I mean, there are going to be consequences. I mean, not just cost, but you see, reputationally, and because you have the court saying already that, look, we're not going to entertain you unless you really have a serious argument. And if you really have a serious argument, they're not going to stop you. So I think it's really a question: is there anything else seriously to be argued at that stage? Sometimes, and I can't say that um, that it will never be. There may very well be a serious issue, and there will be lawyers to take it. But if there isn't, because all the arguments would have been made earlier on, then I think it's fair for the court to say, look, you can't waste time.
Okay, and another question that we have is, so you talked about earlier how you think that life imprisonment would be a better option, but we also received another question where should the death penalty be given only in extreme cases where the crime is considered to be very harmful or brings a lot of damage?
I mean, it's easier for public to support death penalty when it comes to a very serious terrorist attack, or a young child is brutally murdered. But I think if you take a principled stance, it must mean that the death penalty is wrong and should never be applied. But of course, I mean, that's a matter of opinion, and everyone will have a different opinion. But they largely fall into two groups. One would be, look, if the death penalty is wrong, you cannot apply it in any circumstance. The other group will say, yeah, I think the death penalty is wrong, but yeah, if it's such a serious crime, I can understand. It's a matter of opinion and what you're guided by in coming to your opinion.
Okay, so another question in the chat from Rashvina. She said, my humble opinion is that any offender is aware of such law that has been passed, which is a death penalty for certain matters like drugs, for an instance. Any layman would know that. Question is that why should the law be considerate of granting the order or not when it was the offender's responsibility to not have put himself in that situation? Some are being wrongfully framed, yes, but besides those situations, so personal responsibility of criminals, if they already know, then yeah.
I see. So what the person is asked, what the member of the audience is asking is that, look, the fact of the matter is that everyone knows for certain crimes you get the death penalty. So, I mean, why do you express sympathy for someone who has committed a crime knowing what the penalty is going to be? Well, I mean, one point that we can discuss is that everyone makes mistakes. I think all of us, maybe once a day or more than once a day, do something wrong that we should not be doing. Of course, I mean, it's on a much minor scale. So humans are fallible, they make mistakes, even though I think all of us understand that you put your finger in a pot of boiling water, it's going to get burnt. Some people still will put their finger in the pot of boiling water. Mistakes happen, people cannot control certain urges. So I think it is, in my opinion, a little bit perhaps simplistic to say that, look, you know what the punishment is, so why should we sympathize with you if you committed the crime? I mean, people make mistakes, and again, there has to be some proportionality as well. I mean, when it comes to drug trafficking, I mean, my opinion, many offenders would not necessarily deserve the death penalty. So I think there are different factors that come into play.
Okay, we have a question from Mirza, who is not from a law background. Said he wants to know if Malaysia is going to abolish the death penalty or didn't want to use that law. Is it because it's morally wise, or is it because it's the right decision?
I did touch on this a bit earlier on, and I think the answer from that can be found based on what was said in Parliament, and maybe I think there were two main speeches made in Parliament. First in 2018, when the amendments to the first amendments to the drug trafficking rules laws came about. I think it was then the then minister in the Prime Minister's office, Datuk Seri Azalina Othman, what she said in Parliament when they were giving judges the discretion for the first time in 2018 for drug trafficking cases. She said the amendments were for the good of the nation. Abolition of the mandatory death penalty had taken 34 years. The government had taken into consideration the views and suggestions of 30 million Malaysians in drafting the amendment, which will add an element to mercy in certain situations where the judge sees fit. So I think the 2018 amendments seem to be driven by, look, we want to exercise some compassion in the appropriate case, exercise some mercy. That was in 2018. What Ram Kapal Singh, the then Deputy Law Minister, said in 2023, when the Malaysian Parliament passed the latest amendments abolishing the mandatory death penalty, he highlighted that capital punishment was an irreversible sentence. It has not been an effective deterrent. You cannot arbitrarily ignore the existence of the inherent right to life of every individual, and that the death penalty has not brought about the results it was intended to bring. So those are the reasons why I think Malaysia has moved, stepping away from the mandatory death penalty, and eventually I think the death penalty will only be used for the rarest and most serious of crimes.
Okay, so I have a question for me about comparing the international perspectives of human rights versus what many would consider the Asian values, where people see human rights or the principles of human rights in Asia to be different and more community-based. Do you think this impacts how death penalty is viewed among the public? And do you think that impacts how maybe people from outside Southeast Asia would view our practices in the region?
I mean, I don't think there are two different human rights standards. Human rights are human rights. I don't think there's a Western standard. I don't think there's the Eastern standard. And I certainly don't think there's a different Southeast Asian standard. Human rights are human rights. These labels, Asian values, Asian human rights, I mean, these are labels used by politicians for political purposes. So, I mean, I do not think that that should hold back Southeast Asian countries. And I think Southeast Asia and Asian countries, many countries are taking concrete steps to do away with the death penalty, or at least have a moratorium. And I would add further that I think one of the biggest blocks to doing away with the death penalty would be the behavior of the US. The US still retains the death penalty, thus making it very difficult for other countries to, or people, or anti-death penalty advocates in other countries to put pressure on their own governments to do away with the death penalty.
So following that, we have another question from Wendy. You mentioned America and all that, but why is Singapore specifically so uncompromising when it comes to the death penalty?
Because I think, I mean, they are of the opinion, I mean, they hold this opinion, they are of the opinion that if we do not deter traffickers sufficiently, the supply of drugs in Singapore will increase, and correspondingly, there'll be more drug addicts. So they see it as, if we can be very tough on drug traffickers and impose very harsh sentences as a deterrent, it must mean that the supply of drugs in Singapore goes down and there will be fewer drug addicts. It'll be harder to get drugs. I mean, that's their view, and I mean, they're the government, and that's what they have decided.
Okay, we think we have time for one last question. If anybody else from the audience, if not, we're gonna end this session today. Going once, going twice. Okay, so thank you so much, Eugene, for your time today. But before everybody leaves, if you guys are comfortable, can you open your camera, switch on your camera so we can take a group photo? If everyone's okay. Okay, take photo. 1, 2. Okay, so thank you guys for joining us today. I just wanted to share one more upcoming event that we have next week on Friday, the 26th. So if you guys are interested in another death penalty event, please scan this QR code or visit our social media pages. That's all for today. Thank you so much once again, Eugene, for your time and your wisdom. And I hope everybody else has a great rest of your day. And you as
It's
well,
been a
Eugene.
pleasure. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.